Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. On this episode, we're going to be looking at a guy from the history named James Adair, who it says right here, James Adair was a native of Ireland who went to North America and became a trader with the Native Americans of the Southeastern woodlands. It says he wrote a book called The History of the American Indians. Now that title would lead you to believe that it's talking about the entire continent of American Indians, but it's just talking about 5 Southeastern American Indian tribes, which he had contact with for over 30 years. And when you go look at it, it says a noted edition of a classic work detailing the cultures of 5 Southeastern American Indian tribes during the contact period. So let me shoot down one other thing. In his book, he basically put all the weight of his work on the language comparison, saying that the Indians had the similar language as the Jews or the lost tribes of Israel. The book was published in 1775, right around the time that Articles of a Confederation was written, where they were deciding how they were going to take this land from the American Indian nations. I'm going to go in a book from about 104 years before that, from 1671, called America, being the latest and most accurate description of the New World, containing the original of the inhabitants. The first thing I'm going to say is that he explains right here that a lot of the tribes in the Western Hemisphere have different languages amongst themselves. It says there are several languages and strange words spoken among the inhabitants of America. For the Hurons call a head Sayanta, the Mexicans Tonocochle, the inhabitants of New Netherland Anansi, the Brazilians Akanga, the Teos Bape. The figures 1, 2, 3, and 4, the Herons tell us is Esqueta, Tini, Henshin, and Dat. The Mexicans, Si, Ome, Yai, Nabawe, etc., etc. So he's going on to say that, and so it is generally with all other words which agree not in the least one with the other, so that every territory had not only a several dialect, but many places they use besides 2, 3, and are more distinct speeches, not relating in the least one to another. So it's saying right there that the people in the Western Hemisphere aren't the same in their languages. So he can't say that. That's for one thing. James Adair can't say the American Indians in the entirety are of the lost tribes of Israel based upon the languages. But then right over here on this next page, it says some would derive the Americans from the Jews, others from the 10 tribes of Israel carried into captivity, the ground of which opinions is that the Jews and Israelites were scattered among all nations. Therefore, they conclude that America was also populated by them, the rather because the ancient Jews and Americans were of one complexion. Pause. So that's the one thing I will attribute to this work right here of James Adair. In order for anybody to think that people are of another people, they would have to look alike. So people know that the original Jews or the original Israelites were so-called black. So that is a correlating reference to the American Indian being so-called black. But getting back over here to the book and what it says, it's saying that the Jews go alike one and another, that they look the same and they went alike habited, but going without shoes, only wearing sandals and upper coat over a shorter linen vest. But it says right here that Americans change their habits according as they live in cold or hot countries and go not in the least like one another. It goes on to say that the ceremony of circumcision has been scattered about the face of the earth by the Jews. And that says that this makes evident their scatterings about the face of the earth, but will not bring them to reach America. Right here, but will not bring them to reach America. The sacred text sets forth a twofold description of the Jews. So he goes to break down who the Jews are. And I did a video previously showing how the same thing that happened to them is the same thing that happened to the American Indian over here. It's called transformism. It goes on to talk about what happened to the Jews, and it says that they were basically scattered about and then made to where they couldn't even congregate. It talks about instances where they were put under basically all these restrictions, and at other points it says they were warring with all these different people where they made such incursions on the Greek Empire that at last they became sole matters thereof. We cannot but easily judge by this how little opportunity the 10 tribes had to be assembled together from remote countries as to go long journeys through untracked ways and full of enemies to travel to America. Goes on to say right here that how is it possible that in America they should at once, meaning all of them at one time, have forgotten their extract, laws, circumcision, language, and other ceremonies, when the rest of them observed nothing more strictly in all parts of the earth. So it's saying all the other lost tribes of Jews or Israelites kept the traditions, the languages, and everything, the ceremonies together, even though they were scattered about. So it couldn't be that they came way over to the Americas and forgot all that stuff all at once. I'll rather rely on the logic from this book 104 years before James Adair book was put out. But let's go back over here and look at James Adair. Where do we go? None else than the Wikipedia page. And on here, it says that in 1775, again, right around the time of the Articles of Confederation, when they were deciding to take this whole landmass from Indian people, it says stimulated by the encouragement of a few intimate friends, such as Sir William Johnson, 1st Baronet, Colonel George Corrigan, George Gatlin, and Lachlan McGilvary. Now, Lachlan McGilvary is a guy who says right here was one of several Scottish Highlanders. That means he was from the Highlands of Scotland, recruited by James Oglethorpe to act as settler soldiers protecting the frontiers of Georgia from Spanish in Florida, the French in the Alabama basin, and the Indian allies of the Spanish and the French. So he was protecting them from the Indians, not from the Spanish or the French. But I like to point that out just to show you how they worded that. It says that the protecting the frontiers of Georgia from the Spanish in Florida, the French in the Alabama basin, and the Indian allies of the Spanish and the French. That is a basis for how they do it, how they write it out. But the important factor to this is James Oglethorpe, which came to Georgia, and the first thing he did was set up a Freemasonic lodge in 1734. I believe it was called Solomon's Lodge or Solomon's Temple 1, which is the same exact one that King James was from in Scotland. So this guy, Lachlan McGilvary, is connected to James Oglethorpe. But it says the guy, Lachlan McGilvary, was a prosperous fur trader and planter in colonial Georgia with interests that extended from Savannah to what is now central Alabama. This dude, George Gatlin, was an American businessman specializing in Indian trade, an Indian commissioner and plantation owner who lived and conducted business in the colonies of Georgia and South Carolina, primarily around the area known today as Augusta, Georgia. So all these people were involved in the fur trading. George Corrigan was an Irish-born fur trader in the Ohio country of North America who became a key early figure in the region. Now, you would think it would say it would be all about slaves and having plantations, but it's all about Indian and fur trading, which, if you know what that language means, all these dudes were Indian agents who got in there to see how they was going to be able to take the thing down. That's why all of these people encouraged James Adair to write this book, which it says about the book, it must be admitted that a very disproportionate space is given to the hypothesis that the American Indians are descended from the lost tribes of Israel. Now, on a side note, I want to point out that it says that Adair put emphasis in the book regarding cities of refuge. So I just wanted to point out that American Indians, especially in the Southeast, had cities in the 1700s. But basically, this book right here is connected to Freemasonry, and you know the rest. Now, let me back up and touch on the transformism a little bit. So in this book right here, America from 1671, it talks about the lost tribes of Israel right here. It says Jerusalem was their metropolis, although others had their chief residence in Babylon and Alexandria, for there was a Asiatic and a European dispersion. Those of Asia had Babylon. That means the dispersion means the Asians and the Europeans came in and they took the Israelites, everything, basically their land and their culture. But right here it says that those of Asia had Babylon for their chief city and used in their synagogues the Chaldean translation of the Bible. The Europeans kept their seat in Alexandria, where they had a temple like that of Jerusalem. So right there, they copied the Hebrew Israelites' temple. They had the Europeans replicated the temple that was in Jerusalem in their seat at Alexandria. This is what this is is saying right here. It said they employed themselves in the Greek version of the Holy Scripture by the 72 interpreters. So they came in, they took their land, their relics, and their religion. So I'm going to move back into the book where it talks about Peru and correlate how the same thing happened over here. So to point out something real quick, you can see these Indians right here, how they're dressed. They're not dressed in the traditional or the southeastern Indian garb of feather skirts and feather crowns. They have a different dress, but they're Indians from the Western Hemisphere all the same. But right here, you can see it's kind of like a building with like some pillars right here and some cornucopias. Gonna move on to some other. Right here, you see they're dressed differently, but they're Indians, and they have what's looked like to be a castle in the background back there, back here, building. Then right here, you see where there's an Indian king having a flute, blew it while his men hold him up on this thing. Then you also see a man right here standing high on this altar right here. And this is the George Washington Monument. See where he's a man standing on the altar? It's called transformism. And I'm talking about this now because later on in videos, I'm going to talk about another form of transformism that goes past the cosmetic. Now, I pointed out the fact that they dress differently because the book says the Hebrew Israelites dressed all the same and wore sandals. And compared to the American Indian, they didn't all go about alike. So this right here kind of correlates to that fact. Now, just to jump back over here to this altar thing, in a previous video, I talked about someone called Yamakuta, a sacred sky observatory in southeastern North America, where the natives believed that their god, the Great Spirit, had walked as a man walks along his homeward path. And it was a statue there. It says that statue was found to be the center of an exact circle about 150 yards in diameter. It says about 75 yards from the west end of the natural rock dam, they discovered a curious upright statue a little over 4 feet high. It stood at the center of an earth mound, 17 feet in circumference and 6 feet high. So the mound was 6 feet high, and then it had a 4-foot man standing on top of it, basically. Now, if a particular tribe in Wilkes County, Georgia, had a statue and a monument like this, we can presume that Indians all over the Western Hemisphere had the exact thing or something similar to it. And I presume that a lot of those in the Southeast were still standing during the Civil War. That's why after the Civil War, so many of their monuments and Civil War Confederate monuments and this, that, and the other was built up right in replace of those, which is the same thing that John Ogilby said happened to the Hebrew Israelites in Jerusalem, Babylon, and Alexandria. Through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?